Man was about to get buried, but a bear suddenly stops the funeral. What happened next is shocking. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Pine Grove Cemetery as mourners gathered for what should have been an ordinary funeral service. Daniel Carter's death had shocked the small mountain town of Evergreen Falls. A skilled hiker and outdoor enthusiast, the 45-year-old's fatal accident on familiar trails seemed almost impossible to those who knew him best. The mahogany casket sat centered before rows of black folding chairs, its polished surface reflecting the scattered clouds above. Mary Carter, Daniel's wife of 12 years, sat in the front row, her fingers twisting a white handkerchief that had long since become damp with tears. Besides her sat Tom Reynolds, Daniel's best friend since their college days, his hand resting supportively on her shoulder as he whispered words of comfort. "He was the most careful person I knew on those trails," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves. "I still can't believe he just fell." The official report stated Daniel had lost his footing near Ravens Ridge, a tragic but straightforward accident. His body had been found by a group of hikers the next morning, and the local medical examiner had quickly declared it a case of accidental death due to the fall. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, moved quietly among the gathering, ensuring everything was in perfect order. He paused briefly at the casket, adjusting the spray of white lilies that cascaded across its lid. Something in his expression suggested unease, though he quickly masked it with professional composure when he caught Mary's eye. Father Michael Bennett, who had baptized Daniel and Mary's children, stood solemnly at the podium, his weathered prayer book open before him. The elderly priest had known Daniel well. They had often discussed faith and nature during long walks in the church garden. Now, his voice carried across the gathering with practiced gravity. "We are gathered here today to bid farewell to Daniel Carter, a beloved husband, father, friend, and pillar of our community," Father Bennett began. The words seemed to hang in the unusually still air. Daniel's life was a testament to the beauty of God's creation, which he explored with joy and reverence. In the third row, Daniel's teenage children, Emma and James, clung to each other. Emma, 15 and already showing her father's love for the outdoors, struggled to maintain composure. James, 2 years younger, had barely spoken since hearing the news of his father's death. Their Uncle David sat beside them, his own grief evident in the deep lines etched across his face. The gathered crowd represented nearly half the town. Over 100 people had come to pay their respects. Daniel's outdoor equipment shop had been more than just a business. It had been a community hub where he offered free classes on wilderness survival, organized hiking groups for seniors, and sponsored local youth camping trips. His absence would leave a void in Evergreen Falls that nobody quite knew how to fill. Tom stood to deliver the eulogy, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. "Daniel Carter was more than my best friend," he began, his voice catching. "He was the brother I never had, the kind of man who would give you his last dollar or the shirt off his back without hesitation." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool autumn air. Mary noticed Tom's unusual nervousness but attributed it to grief. After all, he had been the last person to see Daniel alive, sharing a drink at their house the night before the accident. They had been discussing some new business venture, though Tom had been vague about the details when she asked later. The funeral director stepped forward again, nodding to the pallbearers. It was time for the final part of the service, the burial itself. 6 men, including Tom and David, moved to their positions around the casket. The cemetery workers stood ready nearby, their spades resting against the mound of excavated earth beside the open grave. Father Bennett raised his hands in blessing. "As we prepare to commit Daniel's body to the earth, we take comfort in knowing his spirit has found peace in the eternal embrace of our Lord." The priest reached for the small silver bowl containing blessed soil, the first handful meant to symbolize the community's final farewell. The mourners rose from their seats, forming a circle around the grave site. Mary stepped forward with Emma and James, their forms silhouetted against the forest that bordered the cemetery. That forest had been Daniel's second home, the place where he had taught his children about wildlife, plants, and the rhythms of nature. Now it seemed to loom over them, its shadows deeper than usual, its silence more profound. Father Bennett's hand paused mid-motion, the soil caught in the moment before release. The first handful of earth would mark the beginning of their final goodbye, the moment when Daniel Carter would truly be laid to rest. The priest opened his mouth to speak the traditional words of committal. That's when they heard it, a sound that would forever change the course of what should have been a simple funeral service. From the depths of the forest came a roar so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, a sound that would mark the beginning of a story far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. The roar echoed through the cemetery again, closer this time, causing the stained glass windows of the small chapel nearby to vibrate. Before anyone could react, the massive form of a grizzly bear burst through the tree line, its brown fur gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Standing over 7 feet tall on its hind legs, the creature's muscular frame dwarfed even the largest headstones. Panic erupted instantaneously. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, dropped his ceremonial folder, papers scattering in the wind like frightened birds. Father Bennett stumbled backward, his prayer book falling forgotten to the ground as he instinctively moved to protect the closest mourners. The cemetery workers abandoned their spades, diving behind the mound of excavated earth beside Daniel's grave. "Everyone, stay calm!" Tom shouted, though his own voice cracked with fear. He grabbed Mary's arm, trying to pull her away from the casket. "We need to get to the cars!" But Mary stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. The bear wasn't behaving like any wild animal they'd ever encountered. Instead of attacking or showing signs of aggression toward the people, it moved with deliberate purpose straight toward Daniel's casket. Its powerful muscles rippled beneath its thick fur as it covered the distance in long, determined strides. Chaos continued to spread through the gathering. Emma and James were quickly pulled away by their Uncle David, who practically carried them behind a large marble mausoleum. Several elderly mourners struggled to run, supported by younger family members as they sought shelter. Some people scrambled up the few trees dotted around the cemetery, while others crouched behind headstones, pulling out phones to call for help. "Someone call animal control!" a voice shouted from somewhere in the crowd. "And the police!" The bear reached the casket, and what happened next left even the most panicked onlookers speechless. Instead of destroying the coffin in a display of brutal strength, the creature began pawing at it with an almost gentle urgency. Its massive claws, capable of finishing with a single swipe, moved with surprising precision along the casket's edges. "What in God's name?" Father Bennett whispered, watching from behind a marble angel statue. In his 40 years of priesthood, he had never seen anything like this. The bear's behavior was completely at odds with everything he knew about wild animals. Mary took a hesitant step forward, drawn by something in the bear's demeanor. Tom tried to hold her back, his face a mask of terror and something else. Was it guilt? But before anyone could stop her, she moved closer to the incredible scene. "Mary, don't!" Several voices called out in unison. The bear paid her no attention, completely focused on its task. Its claws continued to work along the casket's seam, and that's when the first unusual sound emerged from within, a muffled thump that couldn't possibly have come from the movement of the coffin alone. Did anyone else hear that?" Emma's voice carried across the now silent cemetery. The teenager had emerged slightly from behind the mausoleum, her face a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The bear's actions became more insistent, its powerful paws now working with increased urgency. Another thump came from inside the casket, louder this time, impossible to ignore. The sound sent a collective gasp through the gathered crowd. Tom's face had gone completely white. He stumbled backward, nearly falling over a small headstone. "This isn't possible," he muttered, though only Mary was close enough to hear him. "This can't be happening." The bear suddenly stopped its pawing and let out another roar, this one different from before, almost like a call for help. It turned its massive head toward Mary, and she found herself staring into eyes that held an intelligence she would never have believed possible in a wild animal. The bear's gaze seemed to be pleading with her. "Open it," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper at first. Then louder, with growing conviction, We need to open the casket. Now! The funeral director stepped forward, wringing his hands. Mrs. Carter, I really must advise against. Open it! She demanded, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Something's wrong. Can't you all see? This isn't normal. None of this is normal. The bear stepped back slightly, as if understanding it needed to give them space. Two of the braver pallbearers exchanged glances before cautiously approaching the casket. The bear watched them intently but made no aggressive moves. Careful, Father Bennett advised, having found his courage and moved closer as well. Take it slowly. The pallbearers reached for the casket's latches, their hands trembling. The bear remained surprisingly still, its eyes fixed on their movements. As they began to work the mechanisms, another thump came from within, stronger this time, urgent and unmistakable. Tom suddenly lurched forward. Stop! You can't! But before he could finish, several people held him back, struck by the desperate panic in his voice. The latches finally gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the cemetery like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. The bear let out a soft grunt, almost like a command. Mary stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. With trembling hands, she reached for the casket lid. The bear watched, its massive form surprisingly still, as if the entire forest was holding its breath along with every person present. As the lid began to rise, no one in the cemetery could have prepared themselves for what they were about to witness. A moment that would forever change their understanding of both the natural world and human nature itself. The cemetery air crackled with tension as Mary Carter, her hands shaking but determined, lifted the casket lid fully open. What followed was a moment that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Daniel Carter's body lay there, not in the peaceful repose of death, but in the desperate struggle of life, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, his fingers clawing at the satin lining of the coffin. "Oh my God, Daniel!" Mary's scream shattered the shocked silence. "He's alive! Someone help him!" The bear, still standing guard nearby, let out a low grunt that seemed almost satisfied. Father Bennett rushed forward, his years of composure forgotten as he helped Mary and the pallbearers fully remove the casket lid. Daniel's face was pale and covered in sweat, his clothes disheveled from his desperate attempts to escape. "Get a medic!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Call 911! Daniel's eyes were wild with fear and confusion as he tried to sit up, his movements uncoordinated after being confined in the casket. Mary reached for him, tears streaming down her face as she helped him into a sitting position. His first breaths were ragged and desperate, like a drowning man finally breaking the surface. "Easy, easy," Father Bennett cautioned, supporting Daniel's back. "Take slow breaths, son. You're safe now." Emma and James broke free from their uncle's grip, running toward their father with cries of disbelief and joy. "Dad! Dad!" They crashed into the group around the casket, their young faces streaked with tears of relief and confusion. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, stood frozen in shock, his professional demeanor completely shattered. "This is impossible," he muttered. "The death certificate, the examination, everything was in order." Daniel's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, his throat dry and raw. "Water, please." Several people rushed forward with bottles of water. As he took small sips, his gaze darted around the gathering, finally fixing on Tom, who stood apart from the crowd, his face a mask of horror. "The hiking accident," Daniel managed to say between breaths. "It wasn't. I didn't fall." The bear, which had remained surprisingly calm throughout the revelation, suddenly turned its massive head toward Tom, letting out a low, threatening growl. Tom took several steps backward, his eyes darting between the bear and the gathering crowd. Mary held her husband's hand tightly, afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Daniel, what happened? How is this possible?" The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air as emergency vehicles responded to the multiple 911 calls. Daniel's breathing had steadied somewhat, but his voice was still weak. "I remember, drinks with Tom. Then everything went dark. Woke up, Couldn't move much, couldn't call out. Dr. Sarah Anderson, who had been among the mourners, pushed through the crowd. I need to examine him immediately. Everyone, please step back and give him some space. The local physician began checking Daniel's vital signs, her professional training kicking in despite the extraordinary circumstances. His pupils are reactive, she announced, shining a penlight in Daniel's eyes. Pulse is rapid but strong. He's showing signs of dehydration and possible drug effects. We need to get him to the hospital right away. The bear, surprisingly, seemed to understand the need to make way for medical help. It backed up several paces, though its eyes remained fixed on Tom, who had edged even further away from the gathering. Emma, still clutching her father's hand, suddenly spoke up. The bear, it knew. Somehow it knew Dad was alive in there. But how? Daniel's eyes focused on the massive creature, and a flash of recognition crossed his face. The cub, he whispered. The trapped cub from 3 years ago. The paramedics arrived, their professionalism momentarily faltering at the sight of the grizzly bear standing guard near their patient. But the bear remained calm, watching intently as they began their assessment and treatment of Daniel. We're detecting traces of an unknown substance in his system, one paramedic reported after running initial tests. Possible poisoning. Police will need to be involved. At those words, Tom turned and sprinted toward the parking lot. But he didn't get far. 2 off-duty police officers who had been attending the funeral quickly tackled him to the ground. The bear let out a roar that seemed to carry satisfaction at Tom's capture. As the paramedics prepared to transport Daniel to the hospital, Mary couldn't help but marvel at the incredible chain of events. Her husband, who had been declared dead, was alive. He had been saved by a bear, not just any bear, but one with an apparent connection to him. And Tom, their trusted friend, now appeared to be at the center of what was clearly a sinister plot. The bear watched as Daniel was carefully transferred to a stretcher. Before the paramedics could wheel him away, Daniel reached out a weak hand toward the creature. Thank you, he whispered, his voice carrying a depth of gratitude that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. The massive grizzly dipped its head in what almost looked like a nod, then turned toward the forest. As it disappeared back into the trees, the gathered crowd stood in amazed silence, witnesses to what could only be described as a miracle, one that had been orchestrated by the most unlikely of guardians. As the ambulance prepared to depart with Daniel, Mary turned to Father Bennett. Father, she said, her voice filled with wonder. I believe we just witnessed divine intervention. It just came in a form none of us could have expected. The priest nodded, still stunned by the events. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he replied, watching the bear's retreating form. Sometimes, it seems, through the most extraordinary of messengers. In the sterile quiet of Evergreen Falls Memorial Hospital's private room, Daniel Carter sat propped up against white pillows, color slowly returning to his face as 4 fluids dripped steadily into his arm. Mary sat beside him, still holding his hand as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. Through the window, they could see news vans gathering in the parking lot below. Word of the miraculous rescue had spread quickly. Tell us about the bear, Dad, Emma urged, perched on the edge of his hospital bed. James nodded eagerly beside her, both children still processing the extraordinary events of the day. The police had already taken initial statements, but this was the first moment the family had alone together. Daniel's eyes grew distant as he recalled that day 3 years ago. I was doing trail maintenance up near Thunder Ridge, he began, his voice stronger now after treatment. It was early spring, just as the last snow was melting. That's when I heard it, a sound that broke my heart. A bear cub crying in pain. Mary remembered that day. Daniel had come home late, his clothes torn and muddy, but with a light in his eyes she'd never seen before. He tried to tell her about it then, but some experiences defy easy description. The cub was caught in an illegal poacher's trap, Daniel continued, anger flickering across his face. One of those terrible steel things with teeth. Must have been there for hours, maybe days. Its mother was nowhere in sight, probably scared off by humans or... He let the sentence hang, the implications clear. Emma squeezed her father's hand encouragingly. "What did you do?" "What anyone would do," Daniel said, though everyone in the room knew that wasn't true. Most people would have called animal control or run the other way. I approached slowly, talking softly the whole time. The cub was terrified, but too exhausted to fight. I had my trail maintenance tools with me, including heavy-duty wire cutters. The room was silent except for the steady beep of medical monitors as Daniel continued. It took almost 2 hours. The cub was remarkably still, as if it knew I was trying to help. Once I got the trap open, I could see the wound was deep. I had my first aid kit, the one I always carry for emergencies. Used almost everything in it cleaning and bandaging that paw. "Weren't you scared?" James asked, his eyes wide. Daniel nodded. "Terrified. But sometimes compassion has to be stronger than fear." After I bandaged the paw, I gave the cub some water and a few granola bars from my pack. It was so gentle taking them, nothing like what you'd expect from a wild animal. Then it just looked at me. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. The same eyes I saw today at the cemetery. A knock at the door interrupted the story. Dr. Anderson entered, holding a tablet with test results. "Your blood work shows traces of a sophisticated sedative," she reported, her face grave. "One that would have slowed your vital signs to nearly undetectable levels. Without the bear's intervention." She left the sentence unfinished. Mary's grip on Daniel's hand tightened. "But how did the bear know? How could it possibly have known you were alive in there?" Daniel smiled softly. "After I helped the cub that day, I went back to check on it several times. Brought medical supplies, food. The cub was always there, waiting. I watched it heal, grow stronger. But it was more than that. We developed a kind of understanding. I know it sounds crazy, but that bear remembered me. It remembered kindness. Bears are incredibly intelligent animals," Dr. Anderson offered. "They have excellent memory and complex social behaviors we're only beginning to understand. There are documented cases of bears recognizing specific humans years after interaction. But to recognize someone enough to know they're in danger?" Mary wondered aloud. "To actually intervene in a funeral?" Daniel's expression grew more serious. "That's what's been bothering me. How did the bear know to come to the cemetery at that exact moment? Unless..." His face darkened. "Unless it had been watching. Following. Almost as if it knew something was wrong before anyone else did." A police officer appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Carter? We need to ask you some more questions about Mr. Reynolds. He said some concerning things during interrogation." Daniel nodded slowly. "The bear wasn't just at the cemetery by chance. I remember fragments from that night with Tom. The drink he insisted I have. Then feeling strange, dizzy. I thought I heard movement in the woods behind the house, a low growl." "Are you saying the bear was watching you even then?" Mary asked, a chill running down her spine despite the warm hospital room. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that after I saved its life, that bear appointed itself as my protector. It must have seen what Tom did, followed the events as they unfolded, and knew exactly when it needed to act." Emma stood up suddenly, moving to the window. "Dad, look!" Down below, at the edge of the woods behind the hospital, a large form was just visible in the gathering dusk. The bear sat calmly among the trees, its presence both remarkable and somehow reassuring. "My guardian angel," Daniel whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "Though I never expected an angel to have fur and claws." Dr. Anderson made a note in her tablet. "The police will want to hear everything about your history with the bear. This may be the first documented case of animal intervention in an attempted murder. It's extraordinary." Daniel leaned back against his pillows, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But his eyes remained fixed on the distant form of the bear. "You know what's truly extraordinary?" he said softly. "That a simple act of kindness in the woods 3 years ago would end up saving my life. That showing mercy to a wounded cub would lead to that same bear showing up at exactly the right moment to prevent me from being buried alive. The bear remained at its post as night fell, a silent guardian ensuring that the man who had once saved its life was now safe and protected. In the hospital room, the Carter family sat together, united in their gratitude for this unprecedented second chance, and the remarkable bond between a man and a bear that had made it possible. Detective Sarah Martinez sat across from Daniel in his hospital room the next morning, her experienced eyes taking in every detail as she reviewed the growing evidence against Tom Reynolds. The morning sun cast long shadows through the window, where the faithful bear could still be glimpsed at the forest's edge, maintaining its vigilant watch. "The toxicology reports are conclusive," Martinez stated, laying out several documents on the overbed table. "The substance in your system was a sophisticated combination of drugs, one to render you unconscious and another to slow your vital signs to near-death levels. This wasn't an impulsive crime, Mr. Carter. This was carefully planned." Mary, who had refused to leave Daniel's side, gasped softly. "But why? Tom was Daniel's best friend for 20 years. He was Uncle Tom to our children, for heaven's sake." Detective Martinez pulled out another document, a thick stack of financial records. "We've been going through Mr. Reynolds' finances. What we found is disturbing. Your outdoor equipment store, Mr. Carter, how much is it worth?" Daniel frowned. "We just had it valued last month for insurance purposes. Around $2.4 million, including all assets and the property itself. Tom handles all our financial documentation as the store's accountant. And who would inherit your share if something happened to you?" Mary's face went pale as realization dawned. "According to the business partnership agreement, Tom would. We set it up that way years ago, when the business was just starting. It seemed sensible at the time. If anything happened to Daniel, the business would be in experienced hands." "Exactly," Martinez nodded grimly. "But here's what you didn't know. Mr. Reynolds is in severe financial trouble. Gambling debts, failed investments, secret loans. He's over $1.8 million in debt to some very dangerous people." Daniel struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the movement. "That's impossible. I review the business accounts every month. Everything was fine. He was cooking the books," Martinez explained. "Our forensic accountants are still unraveling it all, but it appears he's been embezzling small amounts for years, covering his tracks with false documentation. But recently his creditors started demanding payment in full. He was desperate." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chen entered, holding a laptop. "Detective, you need to see this. We just found encrypted emails on Reynolds' computer. He's been corresponding with someone known only as the Chemist for months, specifically asking about drugs that could mimic death." Martinez took the laptop, her expression hardening as she read. "The plan was elaborate. He needed you declared finished, Mr. Carter, but he needed it to look natural. A hiking accident would raise few questions, given your hobby. The drugs would make you appear finished to a cursory examination. But the medical examiner," Mary began, "was never actually consulted," Martinez cut in. "The death certificate is a forgery. Mr. Reynolds used his access to your business documentation to create it. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, has admitted he felt something was off but was pressured by Reynolds to proceed quickly with the funeral." Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. "The night it happened, Tom showed up unexpectedly with a bottle of whiskey. Said he needed to discuss an urgent business matter. We found the bottle in your trash," Martinez confirmed. "Traces of the drugs were still present. He counted on your trust in him, knew you wouldn't question sharing a drink with an old friend." A soft growl from outside drew their attention. The bear had moved closer to the hospital building, its massive form casting a shadow on the manicured lawn. Several hospital staff members had gathered at a safe distance, taking photos of the remarkable animal. "Your unusual guardian has been quite helpful to our investigation," Martinez noted with a slight smile. "When we searched the woods behind your house, we found evidence that the bear had been watching. Broken branches, fur, and most importantly, tracks that led from your back porch all the way to where you were found unconscious on the trail." Mary's eyes widened. You mean the bear followed Tom when he moved Daniel? Exactly. Reynolds has admitted that after you lost consciousness, he drove you to the trail and arranged your body to look like you had fallen. He needed to establish the accident scenario. What he didn't count on was having a witness, albeit an unusual one. Officer Chen stepped forward again. We've also discovered why the bear chose that specific moment to intervene at the funeral. Reynolds had planned to ensure you were really finished by. He paused, uncomfortable with the words. By driving a stake through the casket into my heart. Daniel finished quietly. A final guarantee that if I wasn't gone already, I would be. Martinez nodded grimly. We found the modified stake in his car trunk. The bear must have somehow sensed the immediate danger. These animals are incredibly intuitive, and this one clearly has a special connection with you. Mary sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the revelations. All those years of friendship, our children called him Uncle, and he was planning this all along? The planning appears to have started about 6 months ago, Martinez clarified. When his financial situation became dire. In his confession, he claimed he felt trapped, that he convinced himself it was the only way out. He said he chose what he thought would be the most merciful method. Daniel laughed bitterly. Merciful? I was conscious through most of it. Paralyzed, unable to move or speak, but aware. I felt them closing the casket, heard the funeral service. If it hadn't been for that bear. A commotion outside interrupted them. The bear had stood up on its hind legs, focusing intently on something, or someone, approaching the hospital. Through the window, they could see a police transport vehicle arriving, presumably bringing Tom for additional questioning. The bear's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, a deep, threatening growl that could be heard even through the hospital windows. The transport vehicle quickly changed its route, taking a different entrance, while the bear settled back down, seemingly satisfied that its message had been received. Your protector isn't taking any chances, Martinez observed. I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of police work. A bear not only saving someone from being buried alive but actively participating in bringing justice to the perpetrator. It's unprecedented. Daniel looked out at his unlikely guardian with profound gratitude. 3 years ago, I saved that bear when it was a vulnerable cub caught in a trap. Now it saved me from a different kind of trap, one set by someone I thought was my friend. I guess sometimes the truest friendship comes from the most unexpected places. 6 months after the extraordinary events at Pine Grove Cemetery, the Evergreen Falls Courthouse was packed to capacity. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows as Judge Eleanor Matthews prepared to deliver her verdict in the case of the state versus Thomas Reynolds. Daniel Carter sat in the front row, his family beside him, while an unusual spectator maintained watch from the wooded area visible through the courthouse windows, the massive grizzly bear that had become a local legend. Will the defendant please rise? Judge Matthews commanded, her voice carrying authority through the hushed courtroom. Tom Reynolds stood, a shadow of his former self after months in custody. His designer suits had been replaced by prison orange, his once confident demeanor now broken. Mr. Reynolds, the judge began, adjusting her glasses. This court has rarely seen a case that combines such calculated malice with such profound betrayal. You attempted to murder your best friend of 20 years, a man who trusted you with his business, his family's security, and his life. The premeditation involved is chilling. Mary squeezed Daniel's hand as the judge continued. You not only planned his death but intended him to experience the horror of being buried alive. Were it not for an extraordinary intervention that some might call divine, though in this case, it wore fur and had claws, you would have succeeded. The judge paused, shuffling through her papers. The evidence is overwhelming. The forensic accounting records show years of embezzlement. The encrypted emails prove months of planning. The forged death certificate and the modified stake found in your vehicle demonstrate your intent to ensure Mr. Carter's death. This court sentences you to 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. As the gavel struck, marking justice served, a deep, resonant roar echoed from the woods, as if the bear too was expressing its approval of the verdict. Outside the courthouse, as reporters gathered around the Carter family, Daniel's attention was drawn to the forest's edge where his savior waited. The bear had become a constant presence in their lives, though always maintaining a respectful distance. Local wildlife authorities, after much debate, had made an unprecedented decision to leave the bear alone, recognizing its unique behavior and connection to the Carter family. "Mr. Carter," called out a reporter from National Geographic, who had been covering the extraordinary story, "what are your plans now that justice has been served?" Daniel smiled, looking toward the bear. "First, we're establishing the Second Chance Wildlife Foundation. The profits that Tom tried to steal? They're going to fund anti-poaching efforts and wildlife protection across the state. We're starting with removing illegal traps, the very kind that once caught a certain bear cub." Emma stepped forward, her teenager's shyness overcome by passion for the project. "We're also creating educational programs about bears, teaching people that these animals are capable of incredible intelligence and emotional connections. What happened to Dad proves that kindness to animals isn't just right, it can change lives." The bear shifted its weight, almost seeming to stand taller at Emma's words. Over the months, it had become common to see the massive creature patrolling the edges of the Carter family's property, a silent guardian that had captured the imagination of the entire town. Tourist numbers had surged, though the bear showed itself only when the Carters were present. "The foundation is just the beginning," Mary added, her arm linked with Daniel's. "We're working with state legislators to create new wildlife protection laws. The Guardian Bear Act will increase penalties for poaching and establish new conservation areas." Daniel's outdoor equipment store had been transformed too. A new wildlife education center occupied the space where Tom once kept his office, teaching visitors about local wildlife and the importance of conservation. The bear's story was featured prominently, drawing people from across the country. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel walked to the edge of the courthouse lawn, his family following. The bear approached, moving with the same deliberate grace it had shown that day at the funeral. People stopped to watch, phones recording the moment, as Daniel spoke softly to the creature that had saved his life. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saved you once without expecting anything in return. You saved me in ways I'm still trying to comprehend." The bear's intelligent eyes seemed to hold Daniel's gaze, an understanding passing between them that defied conventional explanation. Then, to everyone's amazement, the bear slowly lowered its massive head in what could only be described as a bow. "Dad," James whispered, "do you think it really understands?" Daniel smiled, watching as the bear turned to disappear back into the forest. "I think it understands more than we ever imagined. It understood loyalty when Tom forgot its meaning. It understood justice when it waited and watched for the right moment to act. Most of all, it understood that kindness creates connections that can't be explained, only honored." That evening, as the Carter family celebrated at home, they could hear a familiar, comforting sound from the woods, the bear's deep, rhythmic breathing as it maintained its vigil. The story of the bear who stopped a funeral had evolved into something more, a testament to the extraordinary bonds that can form between species, the power of remembered kindness, and the profound ways that one act of compassion can echo through time to save a life. Local legend says that on quiet nights, you can still see the bear patrolling the edges of Evergreen Falls, a massive shadow moving through the trees. It's said that whenever the Carter family has a gathering, their guardian appears, a reminder that sometimes the truest friendships come in the most unexpected forms, and that kindness, even to a wild creature, has a way of coming back when you need it most. Daniel Carter lived the rest of his life knowing that in saving a bear cub, he had gained more than a guardian. He had become part of a story that would inspire generations to see the natural world, and the creatures within it, with new eyes and open hearts. The bear who stopped a funeral had not just saved a life, it had started a movement, proving that the bonds between humans and animals could be deeper and more meaningful than anyone had ever imagined.